Hello and welcome dear students. Today we are going to discuss an important topic of endocrinology, that is the feedback mechanisms of hormonal regulation, and the objectives of today's lecture are to understand hormonal regulation followed by discussing the need of hormonal regulatory systems. We shall also have a detailed account of the positive feedback mechanism. Then we shall try to understand the negative feedback mechanism with examples. And then we shall underline the concept of feed-forward control mechanism. And finally, we shall talk about the consequences of the failure of hormone regulation. To begin with, let us first understand what hormonal regulation means. As hormones are the chemical messengers of carriers of critical information, hence their secretions must be turned on and off accurately and precisely at the right times. The hormones are responsible for regulating the body's internal homeostasis. In response to the stimulus, the conditions inside the body are altered. In living organisms, there must be some kind of a proper way of knowing when there is a need for a hormone to be secreted, how much it is required, and when that requirement has passed. In order to maintain the exact regulatory function of a hormone, the endocrine gland should receive constant feedback information about the state of the system being regulated, so that the hormone release can be adjusted properly. As far as the biological mechanisms are concerned, the positive and negative feedback mechanisms are the known products of the molecular and physiological processes. Both of these feedback mechanisms represent the most important control systems which are involved in the maintenance of the body's homeostasis. As illustrated in the given figure, the feedback circuits lie at the root of most of the control mechanisms. Feedback mechanisms can be either positive or negative. Negative feedback mechanism is way more common than the positive feedback mechanism. Without these important control feedbacks, an organism can lose the ability of self-regulation. In general, a feedback mechanism tends to either accelerate or inhibit a process. The positive feedback mechanism amplifies the original stimulus, while the negative feedback mechanism slows it down. Now let us have a look on the factors by which target cells determine the concentration of hormones. There are three general factors which determine the concentration of hormones set by the target cells. The first one is production rate. The synthesis and secretion of hormones are the most important regulated aspects of the endocrine control. Such a control is generally mediated by two feedback mechanisms, the positive and the negative feedback mechanisms. The second factor is the delivery rate. This process could be better explained by the example of blood flow to a target organ or the target cell, wherein high blood flow delivers more hormones as compared to the low blood flow. The third factor is the degradation and elimination rate. Hormones have a characteristic property of decay. They are metabolized and excreted to outside the body through several routes similar to all other biomolecules. By shutting off the secretion of a hormone with a very short half-life, its circulating concentration falls. But if a hormone's biological half-life is quite long, the effective concentrations persist for some time after the secretion stops. It is also very important to identify and understand the components of the regulation of each of the hormonal secretion, because the derangements in any of the components results in various endocrine disorders. It has also been seen that manipulation of any component in the regulation pathway provides an opportunity for the therapeutic intervention. There are three general mechanisms by which endocrine glands are actually stimulated to synthesize and release hormones. These are the humoral stimuli, the hormonal stimuli, and the neural stimuli. The secretory function of most of the endocrine target organs is generally under the control of the anterior pituitary, which is in turn controlled by the hypothalamic releasing hormones of the hypothalamus. Dear students, let us now understand the feedback mechanisms in detail. Despite the fact that the external environment is gradually changing, including the availability of resources such as food, water, and space, the physiological conditions like the metabolic rate, body temperature, and other related conditions should be maintained within a narrow range. The endocrine system plays a very significant role in maintaining the body's internal homeostasis through a process called as the negative feedback mechanism. But in various other cases, a rapid change within the internal conditions is very essential, which is often achieved through the positive feedback mechanism. In general, the positive feedback mechanism involves the following phases. First of all, a stimulus disturbs the originally controlled variables, and then the receptor detects the change. Once the receptor has been altered or there is a change in the conformation of the receptor, the information travels through the system's pathway towards the control center. And the control center determines the proper action and sends information to the effector cells. And finally, the initial deviation is intensified. The negative feedback loop mechanism, which operates among most of the hormones, involves the following phases. First of all, the original state is disturbed by a stimulus, and then the receptors of the cells detect the change. The receptor upon stimulation initiates a signaling cascade and gives information to the control center. Once the control center is stimulated, it initiates appropriate action. Equilibrium is restored by counteracting the excessive production rate. Now let's have a look at the different types of feedback mechanisms. Endocrine glands are regulated by many types of feedback mechanisms as depicted in the figure. First, we will try to understand the positive feedback mechanism. The positive feedback mechanism refers that the consequences of the hormonal secretion operating on the secretory cells to provide an augmented drive for secretion. The drive for secretion becomes progressively more intense rather than being self-limiting, as is the case with the negative feedback. In positive feedback, there occurs a direct to positive correlation between the concentration and the process rate. Positive feedback systems are biologically unusual because they often terminate with some kind of explosive event. The positive feedback mechanism is generally less common and it tends to be intrinsically unstable because it generally results in the increase rather than the stabilization of the level of a circulating hormone. The hormone facilitates its own release either directly or indirectly by acting on the anterior pituitary or by stimulating the hypothalamic hormone release respectively. A fine example of a positive feedback system as shown in the given figure involves oxytocin and its major effects. Oxytocin induces contraction of uterine muscles at the time of childbirth. The dilation of the uterine cervix acts as the stimulus for oxytocin secretion. The brain, on receiving this information through its sensory nerves, signals the release of oxytocin from the nerve endings into the posterior pituitary gland. The enhanced uterine contractions in response to oxytocin results in greater dilation of the cervix, which in turn strengthens the signal for oxytocin release until the newborn is expelled out from the uterine cavity. In addition to its role in the childbirth, the hormone oxytocin facilitates several other aspects of the maternal behavior as well. It stimulates the release of milk for a nursing child. And also, it has been observed that increased levels of the oxytocin hormone are believed to be involved in forming a good compatibility and bonding between the mother and a child. Let us take one more example to understand the positive feedback mechanism. During the female menstrual cycle, a positive feedback loop is activated. When the blood level of the estrogen hormone released from the ovaries achieves a high threshold level, at this time the estrogen hormone stimulates the rhythmic release of the gonadotrophic hormone, that is the luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone from the pituitary, and also the hypothalamic gonadotropin releasing hormone. The resultant surge in the gonadotropin secretion results in ovulation and finally the termination of the positive feedback loop. As we have discussed the positive feedback mechanism, now let us try to understand how negative feedback mechanisms regulate homeostasis in our body. In general, Most of the hormone secretions are regulated by a negative feedback mechanism rather than by a positive feedback mechanism. Negative feedback refers that the consequence of the hormonal secretion operating either directly or indirectly on the secretory cells in a negative manner to inhibit further secretion. The negative feedback controls the process rate to prevent the substance accumulation. In contrast to the positive feedback, the negative feedback mechanism reflects a negative correlation between the concentration and the process rate. Most of the homeostatic procedures involve a negative feedback mechanism, as most of the processes achieve equilibrium by going back to their original state. Let us take a simple everyday life example, that is the thermostat. When the temperature in a room falls below a certain preset level, the thermostat signals the furnace to produce heat. On the other hand, when the temperature of the room rises above the preset level, the signal from the thermostat to the furnace is shut off and the heat production stops until the temperature again falls. This is an example of a simple closed loop feedback system. Other systems could be more complex and involve one or more intermediate events or pathways, but the importance of negative feedback regulation remains the same. Now let us have a look at the different types of negative feedback mechanisms. In general, the negative feedback mechanism includes direct negative feedback mechanism and indirect negative feedback mechanism. First, we will have a look on the direct negative feedback mechanism. The direct negative feedback mechanism represents the most common closed loop control mechanism. As shown in the given figure, it involves an increase in the level of a circulating hormone, which in turn decreases the secretory activity of the cells producing it. In this type of feedback mechanism, the specialized groups of nerve cells in the hypothalamus synthesize certain peptides which are secreted into the capillary network feeding the anterior pituitary gland, which then stimulate the pituitary cells to release certain tropic hormones. Such peptides in turn stimulate their particular target gland cells to release the target gland hormone into the general circulation. The latter then exhibits a negative feedback impact on the anterior pituitary in order to regulate the release of the tropic hormone level. Dear students, let us take an example to illustrate the concept of direct negative feedback mechanism. The secretion of thyroxine by the thyroid gland is under the direct control of the pituitary tropic hormone TSH. A high blood level of thyroxine reduces the thyroid stimulating hormone output, which decreases the activity of the thyroid gland, and similarly, a low blood level of thyroxine increases the activity of the thyroid gland. Similar feedback mechanisms control the secretory activity of other target organs, for example, the adrenal cortex. Similarly, in case of parathyroid synthesis, calcitrol possesses specific genomic effects on the primary cells of the parathyroid glands, including the cell proliferation inhibition and the synthesis of parathyroid hormone. Therefore, it acts as a direct negative feedback mechanism between the renal calcitrol production and its main stimulus, that is the PTH. Now, the second type of negative feedback mechanism, that is indirect negative feedback mechanism. In the indirect negative feedback mechanism, the target gland hormone results in the inhibition of the release of the pituitary tropic hormone indirectly by inhibiting the secretion of the hypothalamic releasing hormone. This type of mechanism has been identified to be very important in regulating the adrenal and gonadal hormone secretions. For example, the corticosteroid hormones secreted by the adrenal gland may inhibit the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone or corticotropin indirectly from the anterior pituitary by inhibiting the release of the hypothalamic corticotropin releasing hormone. Dear students, as we have discussed the different types of feedback mechanisms, let us now understand what feed-forward mechanism is. Feed-forward controls or feed-forward mechanisms are generally considered as anticipatory. They prepare the body for an imminent change. For example, after eating a meal rich in glucose, the secretory cells in the mucosa of the GIT or the gastrointestinal tract secretes a hormone which signals the pancreas to release or secrete insulin. The increased insulin level in the blood by the time of glucose absorption moderates the change in the blood glucose that might otherwise occur if insulin were secreted after the blood glucose concentration started to rise. Feed-forward systems generally remain unaffected by the consequences of the changes they evoke. They are simply signed off after the disappearance of the stimulus. As we discussed in detail the different feedback mechanisms, now let us see what happens when these mechanisms fail. Generally, the physiologic effects of hormones depend largely on the concentration of hormones in the blood and the extracellular fluid. The precise control, coordination and regulation of hormonal concentration represent a very crucial process. Any irregularity in the process of hormonal regulation or any change in the hormone concentration results in diseases. If the endocrine system fails to function properly, it disrupts the body's most vital process called homeostasis, which ultimately results in disorders and diseases. Now, let us take the example of the thyroid gland. There are many diseases associated with an impaired and imbalanced hormone production by the thyroid gland. One of the most common diseases associated is the hypothyroidism. It represents a condition in which there is an insufficient thyroid hormone production. Triiodothyronine T3 or thyroxine T4 are the two thyroid hormones which contain iodine. During iodine deficiency, the body is unable to make sufficient thyroid hormones. This ultimately results in hypothyroidism. The hypothalamus, on sensing these reduced levels of the circulating thyroid hormone, it synthesizes thyroid releasing hormone in response to the low T3 and T4 hormones. Thyroid releasing hormone in turn stimulates the thyroid stimulating hormone synthesis in the anterior pituitary. Stimulation of thyroid stimulating hormone in turn stimulates the growth of the thyroid tissue, which causes swelling in the neck, a condition referred to as goiter, as shown in the given figure. Hypothyroidism can also result in various other additional abnormal conditions such as fatigue, reduced heart rate, and also weight gain. Because the thyroid hormone is very important for the normal development of the brain, iodine deficiency is very lethal in children. Hypothyroidism, as represented in the given figure, can also cause a type of mental retardation commonly called as cretinism. Dear students, it was all about today's lecture. Hope you have understood it well. Thank you and goodbye.